My mother's family had all lived and worked in Chile, in fact, for years. I mean, my great-grandfather and my grandfather, they were Scots, and they'd almost, in a sense, been pioneers in that part of southern Chile. I think my great-grandfather had, at some stage or another, helped to try and delimit the frontier between Argentina and Chile, the one that they still are arguing about. And there was a chance to go on an expedition to Colombia, and I was a geologist, and I went on it and, well, in fact, sort of organized it, really. And then once I got there, I just loved it. And so I stayed out there and got a job with an American oil company as a mud logger, somebody who's analyzing the mud that's coming up from these exploration oil wells. And I went through about 3 or 4 different exploration oil wells in Colombia. Then went down to Patagonia. And I always remember then when I arrived there in the middle of winter, and the wind was something ghastly, I mean, unbelievable. And I always remember the stories of these American drillers that used to turn up on airplanes. They'd come down to places like Comodoro Rivadavia, right in the south in Patagonia. They'd be hit by this wind. They'd just step right back inside the plane, go back to America again. They wouldn't fulfill their contracts. But anyway, I mean, I stayed for 3 months down there, and I had an argument with my boss. So I quit. But I'd made quite a lot of money, and it was then that I got together with Donald, who I'd known at Cambridge, Donald Taylor. He'd been working on a hydroelectric dam in New Guinea as a hydrologist. And we decided to pool our money and put it into visiting various tribal groups in Colombia. Those are the Tucano groups in northwest Amazonia, in an area called the Vaupés. Now all these people are completely clothed up, but they have this beautiful feather headgear that they keep inside a box inside the malokas, which they hang from the roof, and it's only brought down on ritual occasions. In complete contrast, the Tucano are in northwest Amazonia. These people, who are long-haired and wander around the mountainsides of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta on the northern Caribbean coast of Colombia, have long black hair. They go around almost in sort of Roman togas. They were really quite extraordinary people. That was the village we stayed in, which later I tried to get into on this recent trip and couldn't. They threw me out. But, and there's one of their priests, one of their mamas, as they're called. But the main purpose of going to visit all these tribes was to collect their music, and the music is quite extraordinary in these different tribes, and terrifically varied. This man is, in fact, playing a human bone flute. That, in fact, we were told was a missionary's tibia bone that they'd killed. And I think that it was an amazing experience to spend 14 months recording tribal music. So it was a sort of a valid thing to do. And at the end of that trip, we made 3 little films. When I went back to Colombia in 1967, and I was reading the newspaper, and I suddenly discovered that a group of Indians whose music we'd recorded had gone. And I just thought, my God, you know, I should actually try and record these ways of life before they all go. And that's what sort of inspired me to write, I don't know, on 3 or 4 pieces of paper, write back to Granada and say, we should do a film about, I think I called it The Vanishing Tribes of South America or something. Eventually they backed the idea of Disappearing World. The theme that I started was the disappearance of ways of life. And I wanted to see the forces which were actually making those ways of life disappear, the human forces involved, basically of the dominant society. So one film, the film about the Quiver, who were a nomadic people, they were being eradicated basically by cattlemen who were coming down onto the plains east of the Andes, which run out to the Orinoco. There was a very good French-Canadian anthropologist, Bernard Arcon, working with them. And it made an excellent subject of a film. I mean, it really was cowboys and Indians. The cowboys were killing the Indians, and they really were doing that. I'd made a very firm decision that as a filmmaker, I couldn't make those films alone. It was absolutely essential to work with an anthropologist because I didn't understand the tribe. I was just a tourist coming in, basically. But if one worked with an anthropologist, the anthropologist spoke the language and therefore was accepted by the people whom he or she was working with. And those people had never, until we filmed them, had never actually had contact with whites before, which was extraordinary. You really don't expect to turn up and in 5 weeks make a first contact with a group of people. But we did through using an anthropologist. I worked for various years on Disappearing World and then started, well, it isn't really a series, but this thing called Frontier, which has just so far been, I've made 3 films 2 or 3 years ago, really about the frontier of change again, where 2 societies interface, come into contact with each other. One was about the frontier where a slum comes into contact with a major city. I mean, the slum part of a major city, the urban frontier. That was in a port called Guayaquil in Ecuador. We made another one about the mining frontier. I chose in fact, it's the largest emerald mine in the world, in Moser, in Colombia. And the third one was really the contrast between an English rancher who I knew at Cambridge, who'd gone out, in fact, to the Venezuelan-Colombian frontier, and just started to knock down forest and make himself a farm. The contrast of his lifestyle with a campesino, a peasant farmer who was chopping down the forest when we were there, making his own little farm on the other side. And he was a friend of this Englishman, so there was an interrelationship between the two. And after I'd done that, I then had to think, what on earth was I perhaps going to do next? I read this book called In Patagonia by Bruce Chatwin and thought it was a marvelous book. And so I thought, well, why don't I go and see if I could make a frontier program down in Patagonia? And I ended up, in fact, in June 1980, going out initially to the Falkland Islands and then over into Patagonia itself. I spent some time in the Falklands. That's a picture of Port Stanley. And I was, perhaps I shouldn't be saying this, but I found it intensely boring. I thought I might just as well be in the Orkneys. I mean, not that they're in any way boring, but why was I going all that way, thousands and thousands of miles, to make something which really was, to me, very, very British? I just couldn't see there was a very interesting film at that time, foolishly. Anyway, I came back and was slightly uncertain about making a 1-hour documentary down there, because I didn't think that I was really was the right person to make a historical documentary, basically. And suddenly this article appeared in the Financial Times. It was on September the 22nd, 1980. I learnt that the very people we had filmed and the people I had visited way back in 1959 were actually into collecting coca leaves to be then sold to coke dealers in northwest Amazonia. And that they were basically into this cocaine business. And I thought, my goodness me, if one could actually trace from the source the history of what happens from the coca leaf right the way through to cocaine, it could be an absolutely fascinating series of films. And I went out to Colombia, right down in the northwest Amazon, the area of the Tucano Indians, because I knew from our previous trips in 1959-60 that they used coca and they pounded the leaves into a very, very fine powder, which they then kept as a wad in their mouth. Again, it was an essential part of their lives. A Tucano Indian can't go hunting unless he's got coca, a bag of coca with him. He wouldn't go out to make a canoe, or fishing in his canoe, unless he took his coca pouch. The whole idea of making these films about coca and then going through to cocaine was to try and explain and ask, what right have we, Westerners, gringos, call us what you will, whites, to say to a society in South America, stop growing a certain plant because we've got a great drug problem, namely cocaine. And so I was all the time in my research trying to find groups of people whose ways of life were to a degree based on the use of coca. And I managed to get a lift in a DC-3, a Dakota, an old Second World War plane that was shifting gasoline into the laboratories near a place called Miraflores, which is one of the, I'd say, the chief centers of the cocaine business in South America, probably. And each of those cans takes 50 gallons. I don't know how many there are there. But the fumes are so great that you have to leave the doors of the plane off, because otherwise you wouldn't be able to breathe for gasoline fumes. And they shift passengers and people and goods and chickens and fools like me. Well, I went down, not in this one, but in one of these ancient Dakotas. And in fact, another plane had just come in here, and in moving its tail round, had knocked over all the crates of beer. Which were all beer bottles, of beer going at about £1 a bottle. Well, in Colombia, where the peso is worth nothing anyway, I mean, you can imagine what a pound is for a bottle of beer. It's just absolutely crazy. But that's what prices were like down there because of cocaine. And in fact, the only two places one could stay were both, to one degree or another, brothels. I was sleeping in a sort of cardboard constructed brothel. Very nice people they were, the girls in there. I mean, they were at least friendly to me, whereas most of the people were extremely unfriendly because they all suspected me of being a member of the CIA or of the DEA. In a place like Miraflores, death is commonplace. I mean, I happened to go across the airstrip, which was the sort of dividing line between the two sides of Miraflores one morning. And I went across to the shack where I generally had my cup of coffee. And right next door was this fellow laying out his brother being killed. And I mean, I don't know, that week there were 7 people killed in Miraflores. The graveyard was full up. They were having to bury the corpses actually outside the little graveyard. And in fact, just before we made the film, I went back to Miraflores in a last attempt to sort of arrange things and to see whether I really thought I should take a television crew in, I mean a cameraman and sound recordist, whether I was right in doing that, because I knew it was dangerous. And I thought that providing I had somebody, one or two of the major mafia dealers there on my side, and they didn't mind, I, in a sense, had protection. And I went back specifically to try and get one of them on my side. And I was talking one night to the son of one of the big dealers in his house across the airstrip. And the conversation got quite heated, and we were drinking a lot of aguardiente, which is sort of firewater. And this guy suddenly got extremely annoyed with me, and he pointed a finger at me and said, "You're CIA. You've got to be. You're a spy. You've been sent here to spy on us." I said, "I'm not." And he was convinced I was, and I'd given out photographs, because I always went back with with prints of the photographs I'd taken. And some of those, in fact, did have pictures. There were pictures of dealers in them. And he tore the whole lot up. And then he said, "What else you got in that bag?" And he got my tape recorder out, and he ripped the tape out, the cassette out, and kept it. And then he got my passport out. I said, "That's my passport." And I'll look at it. That's me. In that passport, it says I'm a geologist. Well, I was a geologist. I'm now trying to make a film. That's what I'm doing. And, you know, believe me. And he said, "You're not. You're lying." I said, "I'm not." And he got his pistol out and went, pum, pum. 2 shots went past my left ear. The next morning, every morning at 7:20, the planes used to come down from Vicencio. And the planes, the DC-3, started to land, and we started to film. And we'd only shot about 5 minutes of the planes landing, and we'd taken some general scenics of Miraflores. And a guy came up and said, "What does that lens do on your camera? What does it actually do? Does it actually bring people closer? Can I have a look?" Of course, he had a look, so it brought people closer. And in a moment, we were told to get out. But one of the pilots I met there started to tell me about a person who'd been a rubber gatherer, and told me that this person was making cocaine in an area where we'd visited the Indians years and years before. Well, to cut a very long story short, which really did take a long, long time, it took 8 months to actually persuade Eliseo to cooperate with us to make the film. Eventually, he did agree. I went in with him on this little plane into an airstrip in northwest Amazonia. And, well, I won't go into any of the processing, but basically what happens is the Indians bring in the leaves, and then the coqueros, the guys into making the coke, then actually have to process them. And here is a whole load of, that's in fact cocaine base, but in fact the cocaine base they were making was so pure that it at times was almost more refined than the final cocaine, because you'd had to add more acid by the time you made it into final cocaine. And I don't know, on this photograph there could be $200,000 worth of coke there. And I had to work with it. I spent 3 weeks working with this gang. I mean, gradually they got confident that I was all right. I gained their confidence, I suppose. Eliseo was always quite easy. There was no problem with Eliseo. But his assistant didn't like me one little bit and was convinced again that I was CIA or DEA or whatever, that I was a nasty American gringo who was going to do them down. Anyway, Eliseo, he was an absolute character. I mean, he'd taken in lots of arms. He had to have arms because he said that if they ever got attacked by an army patrol or by the police, if they did come through the area, they'd have to defend themselves. And he said to me, "Well, Brian, you know, I'm completely confident in you. I will, you know, you can make the film, but you have to realize that now you're one of us. And if we do get attacked, you're with us." And that's, you know, there's no question about it. I said, "Yes, of course I realize that." And I did realize through the making of this film that, in fact, if it ever did get rough, you had to be on their side. You could call, well, I would never call Eliseo, or indeed what he's doing, I wouldn't call him a crook, per se. He's actually making his living in the best way he can in that area at that point in time. But most people would consider Eliseo a crook, I suppose. I don't actually consider him a crook. But in relation to the Indians, I mean, there is no question about it. He holds those Indians, just as every gaucho, every rubber gatherer held Indians, in a form of debt bondage. He keeps them by giving them goods in advance and just holding them in debt to him. Because you can't pay in money, you're paying in goods the whole time. You're paying with shotguns, you're paying with tiny white glass beads. That's what the Indians wanted, outboard motors. And some of those Indians are in debt up to the extent of 900, even 1,000 pounds, which is an enormous amount of money for an Amazonian Indian. And it's interesting in a way to compare that photograph with, now this isn't exactly the same in Maloka, but it's very close, with that photograph which was taken in 1960. Well, in the previous photograph, they've all got clothes on. Here, I don't think you'll find anybody with tops on at all, except us. There's Donald, the person I was working with. There's myself. I had some hair on my head. Well, on the one hand, it seems perhaps very sad that cultures are really dying out. But on the other hand, if you look at a Tucano Indian who wants the goods that we have, who wants to have outboard motors, it's easier to get about in the Amazon with an outboard motor than to do it by paddle, much easier. The only way which he at present can actually get that outboard motor is to collect coca leaves and sell them to a man like Eliseo. Now, I don't think one should be sad about that in many ways, because the Indian is actually bettering his own life. I don't think you can blame anybody wanting to get the things that they want. You can blame our society for actually causing the whole thing in the first place. Anyway, I had to get on, and I then flew out eventually with some of the workers, in fact, with two of the workers from the lab. And there we are being inspected at Villavicencio Airport. But it's all a setup. I mean, the police don't really look. They might look at my bags, but that's not what it's all about, because the kilo of coke that we brought out was actually behind that seat in the plane. But anyway, I had to leave Colombia because I was only making one film in Colombia, and eventually, as I say, after 8 months, Eliseo did agree to make the film with me. And we hauled in a crew and we made a film about the whole process of making cocaine, which is a slightly original thing to be able to do. I mean, it was amazing that Eliseo did allow us to do that. And so I went to Bolivia, where my intention was to actually show a society based on the whole use of the coca leaf, because they've chewed coca leaves in Bolivia for thousands of years. It's been the center of a society. And today, 80% of the population still, to one degree or another, use coca, one way, form or another. And I decided that in order to go back into history, I'd go to a place called Potosi, which has this extraordinary pyramid-like mountain coming out of the Altiplano. That's up at about 16,000 feet. So you're existing at about between 14 and 15,000 feet up. And that mountain was absolutely full of silver. In the time of the Spanish conquistadors, they discovered it. And at that time, it was full of silver. All the silver, virtually, for the Spanish mint came from Potosi. What I wanted to do, because now the silver's gone and the mountain has got a certain amount of tin, I wanted to film miners taking coca, because miners depend totally on chewing coca. They have coca tea breaks. I mean, just as a worker in a Leyland motor factory has a tea break, they have coca breaks. And so I wanted to find a miner who would actually take me into the mine, and I would work with him and try and see what their lives were like, and also see exactly how they did use coca. And one worked and crawled through these tiny burrows. I mean, it was unbelievable. I could only just squeeze my body through. And you had to then go up great sort of shafts, vertical shafts, to get to the galleries where they were working. And I mean, at 16,000 feet, if you're not used to the altitude, you're panting quite a lot. And I can remember the first time I went up about 100 meters up a vertical shaft. I mean, literally just sort of levering yourself up like this, with your knees splayed out, with the stuff falling down from the guys going up above you. I thought, my God, I wonder if I'm going to make it. And in fact, I mean, I'd had a heart operation, 2 or 3 years before. And when I got to the top, I suddenly felt this flutter. I thought, oh my God, here we go. It's come back, this awful business. But luckily, it was just a momentary thing. I went on. It was fine. But I did get a real impression of the harshness of work of these young guys, because they were all very young. I mean, much younger than me, most of them. There was one old person in that cooperative of 9 of us who was about my age, but otherwise they were in their early 20s. But they worked and worked and worked just to get out very, very little tin. When I was inside the mountain, they started to tell me that there were certain times they couldn't work, and certain times when they knew they were going to find tin, and that everything was controlled by the sort of guardian spirit of the mine, the Tio figure. Now, this is common throughout all tin mines. There is this effigy of a Tio, an uncle. He's a sort of spirit who lives in the mine and who helps the miner locate the veins and find the tin. And if he gets annoyed with you, then you won't find any tin at all. But if he's with you, you're going to find lots of tin. And they always make offerings to him. They always plaster him with coca leaves. They give him cigarettes to smoke. He is the spirit of the mine. Without him, they couldn't work. Without coca, they can't work. The two things are absolutely interlinked. Once a year, there is this extraordinary festival when the miners somehow combine their belief in Tio with their religious belief, Catholic belief in Christ. And they bring the effigies, not of Tio, but the Christian effigies, out of the mine and then process them down the mountainside, flinging dynamite sticks that they use to blast their way into the veins in their galleries around outside the mine. And then I thought, well, if I've got a mine, I must get peasants, campesinos, depending on coca. So I suppose visually I thought, where can I go? And I went up to this area right on the border with Peru, a completely different scene, where again, they were chewing coca, the herd's women, they were mainly women herding, to keep themselves warm. And we spent some time with the Yama herdsmen, and we also saw the Yatiri, the shaman, actually doing a cure over his wife using coca leaves. I mean, it's absolutely essential part of Bolivian culture. You cannot eradicate coca. And yet the Americans are trying, in a sense, to eradicate the use of coca, or at least to a degree. Seems to me total madness. How on earth can you think of doing such a thing to somebody else's culture? I had to travel all over the country, and I had to go to the main the traditional coca producing area, which is the Yungas, down from La Paz. It's quite high up. It's about 3,000 meters up, perhaps a bit less. But it was quite extraordinary going into that area for the first time. I went in on a Sunday. I in fact walked into this area, and it's all terraced with these little green plants. And I thought I was going into an area of French vineyards. They weren't vines, they were coca plants. And those terraces, some of them have been there since the days of the Incas. And that's as far back as coca has been important, or even pre-Inca, to Bolivian society. And then I came out through one of the main centers there, a place called Chulumani, and I was in the main square. And I bought my food that night at this woman's stall and took a picture of her family and her family. And last September, I think it was, some Bolivian narcotics agents came into that area. And the peasants were so annoyed at the fact that the government was trying, under American influence, to eradicate the growing of coca, that they got a hold of those 7 narcotics agents, and they literally hung, drew, and quartered them, dragging their bodies round and round that square. Not content with dragging their bodies round, they cut up their dogs too and dragged them round as well. And that was the kind of anger they felt about people trying to wreck their way of life. And I feel very strongly about it too. I don't see what right we have got to walk into anybody's culture and try and eradicate the essence of that culture. But when we were filming, when we'd come back to film in La Paz last year, suddenly the Falklands War broke out. And I thought, my God, I mean, I was in Patagonia, I was in the Falklands. I ditched all that. What a madman. And then the Ministry of Information, with whom we had to deal, because we had to have permits and everything, they called me in. And the deputy minister guy, person in charge of press, said to me, but don't they all speak Spanish there? I mean, we've got to print something in the newspapers here. They all speak Spanish in the Falklands, don't they? I said, you must be joking. No, nobody speaks any Spanish at all. Nothing to do with Spain, with South America, with Argentina as such. And he was absolutely amazed. But what did become very apparent when we were working there in La Paz was that we actually had to clear out because we wouldn't have been allowed to go on filming once they knew we were a British crew. Well, as luck would have it, we were anyway going to a southern part of Bolivia to film what I thought was going to be the finale of the film, which was an extraordinary ceremony that happens once a year when the communities in this area of a part of Potosí province divide into 2 groups, and they fight ritually, but fiercely. They wear these almost sort of like conquistador helmets made out of hide, toughened, strengthened hide, which are hard, over their heads. And they bash each other with their fists. But at the same time, it was an extraordinary mixture because as well as the bloody side of it, there was also an immensely beautiful side to it, which was all the women came in with their woven awayos, their woven shawls. And the men came in. It was the great time for the youngsters to court the women. They all play these beautiful charangos, which is, I think, some of the most haunting music I've ever heard. It seems to me that today we are forever standardizing the world. And in the case of tribal peoples, there are hundreds and hundreds of different belief systems belonging to different peoples, minorities. But these are always being eradicated. And it's something which I believe very strongly in, that should not happen. And I also believe that whilst there is still the opportunity to record these different ways of life, one should do it fast because they're going to go all too soon. And it's a tremendous loss to the world in which we live.